I hate reading presentations. Do my standard one, like from memory. Yeah. 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 I have like this little thing with that because when I would practice my presentations when I was in high school to like my parents, my dad would always tap a Diet Coke can to point it out to me. And so whenever I hear someone presenting saying it a lot, I just hear this Diet Coke like. Okay. That's aggressive. It's effective though. You learn it. Yeah. Yeah. Professional logic. Yeah. Can everyone hear me? Oh, cool. Cool. Cool, 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 cool. Hi, my name is Elise Carroll. I am a conservator at the Queen Anne's Revenge Conservation Lab in Greenville, North Carolina. Today I'm going to talk about the Lake Phelps canoes and our conservation work with that. So it's not going. I think yeah, I think the door has to be open. Let's try that. Technical difficulties. Always. There we go. So it's perfect. I think I have it working, maybe? Yeah. Okay. I just gotta be patient with it. So, archaeological evidence suggests that Lake Phelps area was occupied at least seasonally by prehistoric Native Americans from the late Paleo-Indian period through the late Woodland period, with artifacts dating back all the way to 900 BC, 800 BC. It is believed that the people who inhabited this area were mostly Algonquin-speaking Native Americans. The Paleo-Indian period, which includes the time before 8000 BC, represents the initial stage of human presence on the North American continent. The people of this period were nomadic hunter-gatherers, hunting animals that would still be alive at the end of the last ice age. The oldest known canoe in the world dates to around the end of the Paleo-Indian period and the beginning of the Archaic period. The Archaic period, which spans from 8000 BC to 1000 BC, follows the receding of the glacier that brought upon the change in climate that is similar to the climate today. People of this period were hunting animals that you could find today and collecting different species of plant-based foods. These people would be moved between several different campsites throughout the year and likely lived in small bands of extended families or groups of families. The woodland period from 1000 BC to 1600 AD represents a gradual shift of more agriculturally based subsistence and permanent settlements. This period is also also broken down into the early woodland, which is 1000 to 300 BC, the middle woodland 300 BC to 800 AD, and the late woodland 800 to 1600 AD. Societies during this time became more internally complex. For example, creating more complex mortuary rituals, construction of burial mounds, and far-reaching trade. During this period, it is also when Native Americans started to use various types of pottery. Around this time, around the timeline you see on the slide, you can see artifacts from the Lake Phelps area that have been discovered so far, various points and pottery shards. Patience with this thing. So the beautiful Lake Phelps is the second largest natural lake in North Carolina and is located in the eastern part of North Carolina between the Albemarle Sound and the Pamlico River. The lake covers 16,000 acres with a maximum depth of around 9 to 10 feet and an average depth of 4.5 feet. The water is incredibly clear due to the lake's higher elevation than the surrounding areas and the fact that it is almost entirely rain-fed. It was not until the 18th century that plantations started to be established in the area and that drainage ditches were cut from the lake into the Scuppernong River to drain the adjacent peat bogs in order to use them for farming. So this is a map of Lake Phelps. The north shore of the lake has the last old growth forest in eastern North Carolina. The trunks of the bald cypress trees measure up to 10 feet in diameter. The north shore is also where all of the Lake Phelps canoes were discovered. It is thinking about it. Technical difficulties. Let's see if I move. There we go. So all the canoes are discovered, all the canoes discovered in the lake are dugout canoes. Usually dugout canoes are made of hardwood, but the Lake Phelps canoes are made of bald cypress from around the lake, the heartwood of which would be naturally resistant to decay. Most of the dugout canoes were 40 feet in length, so the trees to create these canoes were massive. A method Native Americans used to fell the trees would be to light a fire at the base using coatings of mud and straw to make sure the fire did not spread up the tree. And then they would use stone tools to chip away at the charred trunk until the weight of the tree caused it to fall. The bark was then removed all at once, sometimes removing the sapwood, and then they would shape the ends. This is mostly done using stone tools. To hollow out the canoe, a carefully tended fire would slowly burn into the log, using tools to occasionally scrape away the charred wood. Sometimes gum or rosin would be applied to help control what parts of the canoe were burned. Sometimes the canoe would be covered in grease to help protect and seal the wood. These images are from the artist and colonist John White, who saw firsthand how Native Americans made and used dugout canoes during the 16th century. Due to the time and effort put into the dugout canoes, it was important to protect and preserve them for as long as possible. It is believed that Native Americans would bury their canoes when they left the area for a season to help protect the canoes from degrading faster, and these canoes could be used for many years. Dugout canoes were also often used for travel as well as fishing, seen here used in the drawings by John White. Let's see. Next, sorry. So during a period of drought in the 1980s, the water level in Lake Phelps dropped to a point that the canoes could easily be seen sticking out of the lake bed and some out of the water. This was not ideal for their preservation. Buried in sediment under the water, they were mostly in an anaerobic environment, meaning without oxygen. Without oxygen in the sediment, there are fewer microorganisms to feed on the wood and break it down. Once these canoes were spotted, they were brought to the attention of Pettigrew State Park and the Office of State Archaeology. Right here is the sweet spot. So while searching the area, a total of 30 canoes were found. Archaeologists started the process of recording them in 1985. Here you can see staff working to record the exact locations of the canoe for the archaeological record, and so they can be easily found at a later date after they're reburied. Most of the canoes were reburied in place in the 1980s. However, some again became uncovered in 2004, so they're moved and reburied in another location. Of the 30 canoes, it was decided that 4 would be removed and conserved for study and to be placed in various museums around the state so the public could learn about the canoes and the history of the Native Americans who made them. Not only were the locations recorded, but many of them were also sketched and measured in detail. This is the detailed drawing of Canoe 3, dating to 1400 AD, which is one of the 4 canoes that were removed and one of the canoes we are retreating. There's also a detailed drawing of Canoe 4, which dates to the 4th century, and you can see how important documentation is. Presently, we're also working on conserving Canoe 1, which dates to about 700 BC or is about 2,700 years old. Their ages were studied, and we attempted to do dendrochronology. Sorry. This isn't my normal clicker. So we attempted to do dendrochronology, which is the use of comparing tree rings to determine the age of the wood, but unfortunately they were unsuccessful. So instead we used radiocarbon dating or carbon-14 dating. This method was uses the notion that plants and animals are constantly exchanging carbon-14 with the environment while alive, but once dead, the carbon-14 starts to decay at a predictable rate. Measuring the amount of carbon-14 left in an organic artifact tells us how old the artifact is. 19 of the canoes have been dated using this method. Here you can see how many canoes dated to each time period. Although we have artifacts from the Paleo-Indian period, there were no dated canoes from that time period. The oldest canoe we have is from around 2400 BC, or about 4,400 years old. The youngest dates to 1400 AD. You can see here a majority of the canoes are from the Middle Woodland period. Canoe 3 is from 1400 AD, and Canoe 4 is about 340 AD. There we go. In 1986, the 4 canoes were removed from the lake and conserved. Of the 4 recovered, 2 were directly taken from the lakes. Canoes 1 and 2 from right to left. Canoe 2 had the most length out of the 30 canoes found, with a total of about 30 feet. The canoes were removed and as carefully as possible to keep them intact. The other 2 canoes, 3 and 4, were not taken directly from the lake. Canoe 3 was actually found dry, which is not how you want to find an archaeological waterlogged artifact that's been waterlogged for hundreds of years. It was located on the property of a local citizen who had actually turned it into a path in their yard, which is definitely not ideal for artifacts. Canoe 4 was found almost entirely out of water. It was moved to a nearby pond to be kept wet for about 2 months before it could be preserved and conserved. However, this is not ideal either. In the pond, it was uncovered and vulnerable to worms, which turned out to cause a lot of surface damage. It kind of actually looks like Swiss cheese. So here are 2 more photos of Canoe 3 and 4 from different angles. As you can see, they have been broken into multiple pieces, some of which occurred from the many years that they were buried, and some of which occurred while retrieving the artifacts from the lake. So in the 1980s, there was a Texas A&M student experimenting with the use of sugar to conserve waterlogged wood, and that That is what was decided for the 4 Lake Phelps canoes. A large tank was constructed and lined with plastic to prevent leaking. Leslie Bright, an archaeologist working on the project, described that the canoes were treated with beginning at 20% sugar and gradually working up to 100% sugar. There were additives added to prevent fermentation, and to conserve the amount of sugar used, they actually sandwiched the canoes between 2 plastic sheets. Here is the process of it taking place, where you can see canoe 2 with the layering of plastic on top. After saturating the canoes over a course of about 12 weeks, they were moved inside the lab to dry in an ambient temperature and humidity. So just to kind of talk about wood conservation, so you can understand why we're doing what we're doing. With wood that's been sitting underwater for hundreds or thousands of years, it breaks down over time. However, the water has moved into the cells of the wood, supporting the structure and stopping it from completely collapsing. If archaeological wood is dried out without replacing the water inside, then the wood itself would warp, bend, and break. To prevent this, conservators replace the water with some sort of bulking or impregnating agent. The bulking chemical means that the chemical enters the cell wall and helps preserve and support the cell from stopping the shrinking and warping. Impregnation is when the chemical actually fills the center of the cell. The sugar was used as a bulking treatment on the Lake Phelps canoes. However, today sugar is not widely used because other chemicals have been found to do a better job. The main chemical we use today is polyethylene glycol, commonly known as PEG. The storage of these canoes has created a problem. The canoes 3 and 4 were stored and displayed at Pettigrew State Park in an environment that was not very controlled. They suffered drastic swings in temperature and humidity from daily use and seasonal temperature and humidity changes, going from below freezing all the way up to 90 degrees with vastly different humidity levels. This caused the sugar to migrate to the surface, causing damage. So normally treated wood, we'd like to be stored at between 45 to 55% humidity and at ambient temperature with no drastic or sudden changes. In this photo, you can see the canoes were stored at a shed in the park, and eventually someone recognized that the sugar was starting to leach to the surface of the canoes, and they were removed from display in 2010 for reconservation. The canoes were brought to the Queen Anne's Revenge Conservation Lab and were stored in an environmentally controlled environment until they could be worked on. However, all of the canoes also have sugar on their surface, even canoe 2, which remained in a fully climate-controlled case at the Museum of History. Other museums, so it wasn't just the storage environment of canoes 3 and 4. This just shows how much of a major issue conservators are having with sugar and abandoning it in favor of polyethylene glycol. So here's a microscopic view of the sugar on some of the canoes. You can see the large clusters of sugar that raise above the surface in the white areas. These are microscopic sugar crystals, which are extremely difficult to remove and dissolve. And you can see on a microscopic level that the canoe pores and all of the cracks and fragments have had sugar pulled into it and crystallizing. So this is going in even the tunnels created by the worms for that 2 months that the canoe 4 was in the lake. The crystallized sugar is making this damage worse. Notice the bowing of the wood around where the sugar is, it's causing stress. Now, imagine this taking place across a 40-foot canoe. The fact that the sugar is not just on the surface also makes it hard to treat. Because it is below the surface means we cannot mechanically clean the object without damaging the wood itself. And the chemical cleaning has not been very effective because the sugar has been acting as a bit of a protective layer from removing the rest of the surface or the rest of the sugar. In 2015, ECU had a graduate student who her thesis was on testing different methods of cleaning these canoes. Her preferred method was misting them with a 75% reagent alcohol solution with RO water, thinking that less warping would happen with the more alcohol and less drying time. We received a grant by the IMLS to continue this work in 2018, which allowed us to hire conservator Tim Smith to specifically continue cleaning all of these canoes. This process is done by holding a mister about 6 inches away from the wood and spraying the artifact until it's just slightly damp. And then it was left to dry for a day or two. Unfortunately, the first method we used did not work very well. And so Tim spent the research period trying to figure out other ways of treating the canoe. So here are some photos that show some of the smaller fragments with a great surface area covered in sugar. Before is on the left before the treatment, and after is on the right. So it worked some, but we noticed occasionally after drying, new sugar would start appearing again. So Tim decided to move on to poulticing the artifact. After research, we attempted these poultices, essentially using tissue paper that was folded a few times and soaking it until just damp, and then placing the poultice onto the canoe fragments to loosen up the sugar and either have the sugar reabsorb into the wood or absorb into the poultice. It would last for about 3 hours, and then they'd be left to dry out after that. This proved to be pretty gentle because these canoes are thousands of years old. And so we're working on the most gentle way of treating them. This treatment worked very well and removed nearly all the sugar in one of the treatments rather than going over and spraying multiple times. Here you can see a photo of the canoe fragment from before, showing before any treatment, after the misting treatment with reagent alcohol, and after a poulticing treatment. So you can see that the sugar is becoming absorbed in or removed from the surface. So we have now completed all the treatment on canoes 3 and 4. This is canoe 4, the large fragments before and after treatments. So you can see how much of the sugar has come off. Any of the white area that's remaining is where the sugar was extensive. This is the end of canoe 3. Canoe 3 was in much better shape than canoe 4, likely due to its age being 1,000 years fewer and wear and tear. The condition it experienced in the lake would also likely played a role in its current state. Canoe 3 was also had some retreatment in the past, but the only major concentration of surface on canoe 3 there's only some concentration on canoe 3 where canoe 4 was pretty much totally covered. So this is Tim Smith. He was the conservator hired to do the research and work on these canoes. Upon moving on to the larger fragments, the poulticing was not enough. So there was so much sugar in some areas that the poultice would not dissolve it. So we revisited the methodology and changed it slightly. We used just plain RO water or purified water and sprayed the canoes until they're very wet, and then allowed that to dissolve the sugar in. The poulticing was used in specific areas rather than covering the entire artifact because of how large these artifacts are. After this, a few sugar crystals would still remain, and we would use dental picks and tweezers to remove them from the cracks and crevices. This is not super feasible to do on the entire object because of the size of these canoes. Um, and if we had to mechanically clean everything, we would not have been able to finish it during the grant period. Or grant period, this has reinforced why sugar is not an acceptable method of treating archaeological wood. Occasionally, you'll still see it pop up, but we're currently retreating canoes treated this way. But it is important for us to learn from previous treatments to help us grow and find more and better methodologies in the field of conservation. So unfortunately, canoe 3 and 4 are still experiencing sugar migration. We have also collected all of the fragments now of canoe 1. We have actually resubmerged fully one fragment from canoe 1. And so we had to soak out all of the sugar and then replace it with that polyethylene glycol, the chemical we talked about earlier. And actually, as of 2 days ago, it is in the freeze dryer. I peeked on it. It looks beautiful. So we're very excited to see how this goes, but that retreatment's very, very tentative at the moment. So another canoe we're working on is the Lake Waccamaw canoe. In July of 2021, the Office of State Archaeology staff visited the Lake Waccamaw at the request of a local person because his children discovered a canoe while swimming in the lake. The canoe had already suffered damage from an onboard motor and exposure was concerning. So we made a plan to recover it, but the sheer logistics of that took time. So while we were trying to figure out how to recover such a large canoe, he allowed us to store the Lake Waccamaw canoe under his deck and reburied it there for protection. This canoe, the Lake Waccamaw canoe, is 27.5 feet long and is fully intact. We did another C14 dating and it's about 930 years old. So the Office of State Archaeology worked closely with Chief Mike Jacobs and other members of the Waccamaw tribe to plan the canoe's recovery and transportation. This took nearly 2 years to plan. On the day of the recovery, many of the tribe and local community members came to be a part of the recovery team, along with Office of State Archaeology staff and other members of DNCR. We had to physically pick up this canoe, and you can see how many people it took just to get it from the shore into its tank. Thanks to the time and careful planning, everything went very well and smooth with this recovery. It remains intact today, which is really awesome for such a large canoe, and it was a really special day to be a part of. Right now, the Lake Waccamaw canoe is undergoing treatment in Greenville. Fortunately, Chief Mike owns a towing and recovery business, so he actually built or had the tank built custom for this canoe. It is massive. And he was able to transport the canoe in its tank all the way from Lake Waccamaw to our lab in Greenville. The canoe will be with us for several years undergoing treatment, and we'll work with the local community and the tribe to weigh all options of eventual display. At present, the canoe has just finished desalination and is awaiting the polyethylene glycol treatment that we favor. So there we go. So dugout canoes construction and use has had a deep archaeological and cultural impact on North Carolina. To date, North Carolina has found 76 dugout canoes, and our conservation method has evolved rather than using sugar like we would in the 80s to polyethylene glycol and hopefully freeze drying. And that's what I got. Mhm. So The damage from the Lake Waccamaw canoe's outboard motor, you can see about halfway down the canoe, there's actually a line, a gash from where the outboard motor hit it. I don't think you can see it on any of the pictures here, but it's about right there, and it's just this clear straight line. No, it's fortunate that it's not deep enough that it broke it in half, but it is very much now a stress point. So we have to make sure anytime it's lifted, which that takes like 20 people to lift, or our crane plus people, it's crazy. It's long, and we haven't been able to weigh it. Yeah, but it literally it took about 20 people to just pick it up out of the water and get it onto the shore and only move it about 15 feet. So it's heavy. It's essentially 27 feet long of lifting straight water because of how the cells have so much water in them. So if you think lifting water is heavy, imagine lifting 27 feet of water. About a year and a half ago. Yeah, so it came to the lab after this recovery in 2023. Yeah. Yes.
Like Waccamaw is technically fresh, but you just any salt at all.
Yeah, it's fresh water, so it's not nearly like recovering something from the seafloor or anything, that salty level, but it's just kind of allowing us to flush everything out because it is a very sand heavy lake. It has a lot of just sediment and particulate. So we're
Process to get all of it.
yeah, it's just to get it clean enough that it can hang out in purified water and we can see that no more solids or anything's coming out. Yeah.